Today, I'm going to talk to you about why stories matter. I'm going to talk about it especially in the context of young people and mental health, and I'm going to talk about TikTok particularly. But stories have mattered long before TikTok was a social media platform and it was just a sound that the clock would make. Back when I was a small child, I always loved stories. I was a child with a book in my hands or watching TV or listening to a story somewhere because stories fascinated me. I was always drawn in by them. I was always engaged by them. And then when I got a little bit older and I came and I studied here at the University of Birmingham, I studied English literature here, I became really curious about what was it about those stories that would draw you in? What would engage you or what would not? And more importantly, what were the kinds of values that those stories could shape? Those two themes, what would make a story engaging and what kind of social story could it tell, have remained central to my work over the years, especially, as Alex pointed out, in relation to the stories that people tell about their everyday lives. Because stories are important and they matter because people and their experiences matter. And over the last 20 years, the possibility that people can take their stories and they can share them in online contexts, first of all looking at discussion forums and then into blogs and then in social media sites, has meant that the size of the audiences and the kind of resources that people can use to make their stories engaging to share social value have expanded considerably. So stories are also important because of the scale and the means by which they're shared. I'm not alone in finding stories a fascinating object of study. I'm not alone in studying them and finding them important. In fact, over the last 50 years, researchers in linguistics and in the social sciences have also been really interested in how and why stories about personal experience matter. From this perspective and in this field, stories are important, firstly, because they're a way of connecting events and ideas. Stories matter because of the choice that people make to choose one event rather than another, and then to connect those events in sequences that might suggest change or causality. They create plot lines where certain events can be interpreted as problems, while others might be solutions. So I wonder, does anybody in the room here drink coffee? Me? All right, most of you. So imagine this as a little story. I wake up in the morning, I'm feeling a little bit sleepy, I have my cup of coffee, the world is a better place. In that story, the coffee is a solution to my problem. Now imagine that I've drunk my coffee, but I've had an empty stomach, and then all of a sudden I feel, a little bit jittery because that coffee on an empty stomach has spiked my cortisol. Suddenly, the coffee's not the solution anymore, it's a problem. Perhaps some of you in the room might relate to one of those stories. Perhaps you might relate to both of those stories. And that's because stories are not just sequences of events and ideas. They matter because they're interactions between people. They connect tellers and their audiences. The sociolinguist William Labov, who really published a landmark work back in the 1970s about personal experience stories, he claimed that stories are always told with the audience in mind. And he said that the storyteller needs to ward off the response that no one wants to receive, including me, the withering question, so what? I can tell you a story, but if it doesn't engage you, if you dismiss it, if you don't understand it, then the work of that story falls flat. When we consider mental health and well-being, then stories matter very much. As ways of connecting events and ideas, stories can be offered as explanations that attempt to give structure to experience. So, say I develop insomnia. Say that I start to have really severely disrupted sleep and it causes me distress frequently for several months. And that's not explained just by me drinking coffee in the morning. I might want to find a solution to that insomnia. So I might want to treat it through CBTI, which is cognitive behavioural therapy for insomnia, a solution that's well supported by the research. So maybe I might hear a story from somebody who's talking about CBTI, and I think, this might be the solution to my problem. Maybe I might refer myself to a specialist course. Maybe I might buy a book so I can try out this solution for myself. So the story is then a gateway for a future action. And the way that stories create those interactions and also connect tellers with their audiences is crucial in the context of mental health and well-being, because those relationships can foster support between people, maybe as one peer to another, maybe as an expert who offers advice or treatment, or some other kind of resource. So, for these reasons, stories have an important part to play in supporting mental health literacy. So mental health literacy is the term used in research to talk about the factors that people need to make informed decisions about their own well-being and to support others in their communities. It includes what you see here on the screen, the ability to recognise mental health conditions, so for example some of the symptoms of particular issues or even disorders. It includes knowing how, when and where to seek help, either from professionals or informally. It includes basic knowledge of the activities that promote mental well-being, such as healthy eating or sleep or stress management, for example. And it includes promoting positive attitudes towards mental health care. And if you're interested in that topic and you want to know more, I recommend a study by Rosie Mansfield and their colleagues. The role that stories play in supporting mental health literacy matters a great deal in our current context. Last year, the big mental health report from the charity Mind estimated that 1 in 4 of us will experience a mental health problem at some point each year. This year, the charity Rethink Mental Illness found that based on NHS data, people are 8 times more likely to wait over 18 months for mental health treatment compared to physical health treatment. And the charity STEM4, who support teenage mental health, recently reported that 1/3 of young people are turning to social media for DIY help instead. So what are the stories that young people are going to find when they turn to social media for help? The project that Alex mentioned and that I've been leading looks at the role that stories play in supporting mental health literacy, particularly focusing on social media influencers. The work that I'm about to share with you is an effort from a group of amazing people. It's definitely a team effort. I very much want to take this moment to acknowledge my colleagues that you see here on the screen, some of whom are in the room here too. So thank you to Alex Christiansen, to Shoma Lee Craythorne, to Paul Crawford and to Michael Larkin. And a big thank you to the McPinn Foundation, who put young people at the heart of mental health research. Our colleagues at McPinn include Emma Garavini and Eva Asiedu Adu. And most crucially, it involves the 12 young people who formed the Young People's Advisory Group for this project. So these are 12 people from across the UK, aged between 16 and 25, and they have helped shape this research at every stage of the project. So we meet with them every 3 months, sometimes more frequently, and they literally have helped in every way that you could possibly imagine. In this project, we're interested in influencers as key players who communicate about mental health. So we define social media influencers as figures who have gained visibility through online platforms like TikTok and Instagram. This includes micro-influencers who have 10,000 followers and above. It includes mid-range influencers who have 100,000 followers and above, and macro-influencers who have followers lists of over 1 million. Influencers are fascinating because their influence in terms of mental health really began to accelerate 5 years ago. 5 years ago, we would not have been sitting close together in a room like this, because 5 years ago, we were in the middle of navigating the different lockdowns. And at that time, mental health challenges for many people increased. And at the same time, the government began to use influencers to communicate public health messages. Today, if you type influencers and mental health into TikTok's search box, you'll find a range of content from a range of creators. You'll find that there are professional experts like doctors and therapists and psychologists, and there are wellness figures and alternative health practitioners and fitness and holistic coaches, and there are young people documenting their journey through mental health challenges, experts by lived experience. All of them are telling stories about mental health. Now, these influencers, they talk about a whole range of mental health experiences, and they talk about them in a whole range of different ways. So our data involved looking at patterns in 27,000 TikTok videos. Yes, you did hear that correctly, 27,000 TikTok videos, thanks to Alex Christensen. If you want to know more about how we collected that data, talk to Alex later. And those influencers, there were 90 influencers that we gathered data from, and they went across the three categories: professional experts, wellness figures, and lived experience experts. And what you can see on the slide here are line drawings which illustrate the most frequent ways that these influencers talk about mental health. So the professionals are on the left. Yes, I did get that right. And the lived experiences experts are on the right. And in the middle, you've got the wellness influencers. So when we look at the broad patterns in our data, we found that the professionals tended to use storytelling styles that really were about educating their audience. So they wanted to explain the relationships between symptoms and diagnosis, or the effect of treatments in different kind of ways. You might recognize formats like the one on the left there, talking about the 5 signs, a kind of listicle format, setting out the different kinds of signs of a particular condition or diagnosis. Sometimes those experts would also comment on and try and correct the content from other videos online using something called a stitch format, which is not to do with quilting. In TikTok terminology, this is how you join one video to another to comment on it. And typically, these experts would use a kind of talking head format where they would talk directly to the camera to project their expertise, often in a setting like an office. So they would use bookshelves or something like that to signal that they were professional experts. Seldom did they use any of their own personal experiences to bring their stories to life. Now, the wellness influencers in the middle, they also use stories to explain symptoms and treatments, but often this was about non-medical solutions, whether that was to change your diet, exercise a little bit more, use a holistic treatment, perhaps take a supplement. But unlike the professionals, their videos were visually arranged so that they were showing you personally how you could undertake the action that was going to help you improve your mental health and well-being. And typically, what they would also do was subtly, or not so subtly, to include some screenshots that would show you exactly where you could purchase the supplement, resource, or so on and so forth, that you could buy from their Amazon storefront so that you could get better. In contrast to this, the influencers who were sharing their personal stories used a different kind of format. Often they would use something like the day in the life format, so a compilation of curated clips that would draw the audience in. They would use the kind of get ready with me format, so somebody putting their makeup on at the start of the day, and then to talk about their own ups and downs, their journeys, their recoveries, often in many different ways, through different mental health experiences. And so visually what they were doing was showing their daily lives in ways that created a sense of intimacy and a sense of shared experience with their audience. So these stories talk about different aspects of mental health, and they structure them in different ways, both verbally and visually. So what? In what ways does this actually help with mental health literacy? What do you think? Now we're going to see if, as a professor who's also the director of the Digital Media and Communications Programme, can actually use technology properly. For those of you who've got a phone with you, this is your chance to say what you think. Of those 3 types, professionals, lived experience experts, or wellness figures, which do you think would be best at supporting mental health literacy? At this point, I'm going to just move us into the site where I hope we are going to be able to see what you think. Oh, this is so interesting. This is genuinely is really, really interesting to me. It's really interesting because a few months ago, I was talking at a student event in town behind the screens, and I asked the same question with this same poll, and the statistics did not look like this. Very interesting. Genuinely very interesting. So, according to those of you in the room, it's a close tie between professionals and lived experience experts. Okay. Whoa. I feel like we're having the Eurovision Song Contest. Plot twist. Anybody else want to vote? So, according to that, professionals first, lived experience just a little bit behind, and then wellness, not doing too well at all. So, what did we as a research team think about this in relation to what we could see on the screen in terms of mental health literacy? So, on the surface of things, you can see that the different stories support different aspects of mental health literacy. So if we take our professionals first, they're offering a particular kind of information about mental health. Apparently factual accounts of how treatments work, appearing reliable, at least some of the time, which might offer a starting point for someone who wanted to begin a journey into seeking professional help. Although in our data, very often the links to finding that help were either not there at all, or they were hidden, or they were in a landing page somewhere behind the TikTok post. You had to look quite hard to find it. Wellness figures provided information that also offered you non-medical solutions. Often they were making claims that lacked scientific evidence, and even if they were using technical terms like cortisol to talk about stress, there was very little scientific proof that what they were suggesting was reliable. Often those accounts were monetized, and the landing pages took you through to those storefronts that I mentioned where you could buy the products that they recommended. And lived experience experts were also offering information, but a very different kind of information, this time drawing on their personal experience to show how they were getting through the ups and downs of different mental health challenges, which, at least in some cases, offered hope, reassurance, and role models that the audience could take as inspiration. And if we think about how these different figures might change attitudes towards mental health, well, it's really difficult to see how the professionals were doing that. And when we look at the other two categories, the wellness influencers and the lived experience experts, well, it was a bit of a mixed bag, honestly. Some of them were glamorizing mental health, some of them were trivializing mental health, and some of them were actually doing a really good job of normalizing mental health and making it much more possible to have a conversation about it. So based on these observations, we might conclude that some of the stories were helpful, especially the lived experience experts, but also, as you saw, the professionals. And some stories, as you so rightly pointed out, from the wellness sector, really might not be that helpful at all. And that is because stories matter because of the quality of the information that's presented and the types of solutions that are offered. Not always are they available, and sometimes they're not accurate. And stories about mental health matter because there is a great deal at stake in terms of misinformation. That is, information that is inaccurate. You might have seen very recently that The Guardian knew I was going to give an inaugural and talk about this topic, so very kindly they carried out an investigation into the top 100 trending videos with the hashtag mental health tips. What they found in this investigation was that over half of them contained misinformation. And actually that is very much in line with what we have found in this study too. So in our study, what we did was we asked a panel of lived experience experts and we asked a panel of mental health professionals to evaluate a sample of our data and to evaluate the ways that they might be helpful or they might be harmful. And the video that they considered to be the most harmful was this one from a wellness figure who was recommending supplements for treating depression, describing them, as you can see on the screen here, as antidepressant dupes. What you see on the right-hand side of the screen are the quotes from some of the mental health professionals who were in that workshop with us, pointing out that this was a story that was pseudoscience masquerading as science, that it really was not reputable, and that there was really a risk to harm in this kind of storytelling because it might not work and it might actually prevent somebody from seeking the professional help that they needed. Now, I should say, I have the quotes from the professionals here, but the lived experience experts who we talked to were considerably more critical still. Some of the phrasing that they used to describe the harm from this is not appropriate to put in my inaugural lecture, but the strength of their criticality was sharp and on point in this. So if that's the problem, if it's misinformation that's the problem, and professionals have got their place in supporting mental health literacy, we might think that the best way to mitigate this risk is to create better quality content from professionals that provide evidence-based solutions. Indeed, there have been a number of studies that make that point exactly. But if we're going to meet young people where they're at, we really need to understand how they respond to stories and what they might find engaging. If stories are only successful because an audience is engaging with them, we really need to understand what kind of stories young people are likely to watch. What factors go into their decisions to stay and watch? What factors go into their equivalent of the so what, which is scroll past? What is the effect with engaging with the content, and what is the effect of not? So, you'll have guessed, I'm way past the point where I could be described as a young person. So, to really understand what's going on, we needed to talk to young people. And that is what we did earlier this year. So we talked to 88 of them, to be precise. So the data that we gathered comes from 18 focus groups that took place in a cross-section of schools and colleges across the Midlands, including fee-paying schools, selective schools, faith-based schools, non-selective schools, FE colleges and charities across the postcodes of the Midlands to try and capture a really diverse range of perspectives. And we also carried out a set of interviews with people who might not want to take part in those focus groups or were no longer in educational settings so that they could share their views with us. Some of those schools are here today. Thank you for coming. You have, well, I really hope you'll get a sense from what I share next, actually how very, very important it was to actually listen to young people. Because if we had not listened to them, we would have missed something that was really, really important. So just to give you a sense of what the characteristics of the young people that we talked to, over half of them identified as female, 53%, 40% identified as males, 6% preferred not to say, and they came from a whole range of ethnicities, Asian, white British, black, mixed, white European ethnicities, reflecting the rich, multicultural, multi-ethnic nature of urban contexts like the one we're in, but also represent other cities across the UK too. So what we did when we talked to the young people, we showed each group or each interviewee the same 3 videos, each of which was the most representative of the formats in the influencer types that were in our data set. And you can see from the labels on the screen there, the 3 different formats. So there was one from the professionals with the kind of 5 signs format. We had a tutorial from our wellness influencer, where the influencer was demonstrating how you could deal with your anxiety by eating a healthy breakfast, which she claimed was an anxiety antidote. And there was a day in the life experience from a lived experience influencer showing their point of view, a POV, for those of you who might need the glossary, that's for my husband, by the way, for challenging your anxious thoughts. So what we then did was to use those videos as a way of exploring with young people how their own social media practices and the content from these influencers might help their mental health literacy. And we took all of the transcripts from those focus groups and we analysed them using thematic analysis to help understand what the themes that came through the data. Now, if you want to know more about that, I'm really happy to talk to you over drinks afterwards. But for now, what you need to know is that each theme brings to light the different factors that shape the process of choosing whether or not to engage with the different stories about mental health. So here's the first theme. The first factor that matters in deciding whether a story is engaging or not, whether to watch or whether to scroll, rests on a person's expectation of what a site is good for. The design of a site and the practices that people bring to them combine in what researchers call a platform vernacular. These shape the preferences that young people bring to different social media platforms, and they are different one platform to another. When it comes to TikTok, this is really strongly oriented to entertainment. Young people go to TikTok not because they want to be educated, but because they want to consume stories as a pleasurable distraction in their downtime. And at the same time, there is a fatigue in top-down educational mental health content that young people have received earlier in schools. So for health communication to be effective on TikTok, the young people had really strong preferences for what we call infotainment, so content that's blending educational content with formats that they considered to be engaging or entertaining. So in this case, the kind of talking head listicle, not engaging at all. The response time and time again was, we'd scroll past, we'd scroll past, we'd scroll past, we'd scroll past. Secondly, the young people we talked to were very consistent in their opinions about visual formats and whether or not they were engaging. Basically, the more visually rich the content, the more likely that young people would watch it. This is in line with earlier research that has also documented the ways in which content that's really high in media richness, so it's using lots of different resources to communicate, music, captions, voiceover, the more visually rich it is, the better that is for conveying emotionally engaging storytelling. Young people wanted to be shown solutions that they could apply to their own lives. They did not want to listen to an expert talking to them. I'm sorry for those of you who are from the schools and you are here listening to an expert talking to you. Sorry, I feel like at this moment I should turn it into some kind of amazing social media post, and I just can't do that right at this moment. Come back to me later. We can see here, though, why the health professional, in terms of the data we showed them, was considered boring, and instead the visual formatting, like that used in the day in the life, that was combining lots of curating practices to combine lots of different clips with music, was considered both visually interesting and the basis for good advice. However, in the case of the wellness figures, the young people were skeptical of that use of visual editing, interpreting what they were being shown, for in this case, the ingredients of how to make a healthy breakfast, as a marketing technique that ran the risk of being distracting. So we've got a question then about visual content and how that impacts the interpretation of stories. Well, it really matters because visual communication is also underpinning the decisions that people make in terms of whether they're willing to trust the content and trust the content creator. When we talk to the young people in these focus groups, they've got a whole range of strategies to check whether the content they were viewing was trustworthy or not. So, for example, they might look at the comments, or they might check the profile information, or they might look on LinkedIn, or they might cross-reference the content with something that they would see on the NHS website. But they also relied on what they were being shown, so what somebody looked like and how confident their presentation was. And they looked at metrics, seeming to assume that more views meant better quality content, but at the same time being very skeptical about the content they assumed as being generated for self-interest, i.e. doing it for the views or visibility. What somebody looked like and whether the viewer felt that that was like them was also really important in generating trust, but of a rather different kind. As you can see on the far right-hand side of your screen there, it's trust that's operating at a social level. And this is really important because trust operates on two bases. It operates on a cognition-based basis, so the way you judge a person based on their characteristics, like their reliability or their competence, and it's based on your emotions, so your experiences and your expectations that somebody will interpersonally be close to you or not. It seems that the visual strategies being used by the different influencers in our data is working hand in hand with a shift towards emotionally based aspects of trust. We're moving from assessments of trust based on reliability to trust based on relatability. Now, in and of itself, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but we do need to bear in mind that this increasing reliance on the visual and the turn towards emotionally driven trust really opens up the need for critical thinking and careful interpretation, not just of what kind of content is being shared, but how those stories are being conveyed. And this is because images matter. We know from research in psychology that images matter a great deal in terms of how we process information. Our brains process images more quickly than written text. The irony of having written text on the screen here is not lost on me, by the way. Scholars like Erin Newman have explored the way that images create what they called a truthiness effect. So when you're processing information, the more easy it is, it increases the likelihood that you will go along with it. So when you have a claim that's being made and there is visual content that goes alongside it, and those two things are congruent, people are more likely to believe what those claims say. And in marketing, that can be exploited further still. Researchers have documented the way that some sort of images are more persuasive than others. So there was one study like this one on the screen where they looked at how crowdfunding campaigns were constructed. And if the opening screen had somebody's face on it and they were showing some kind of strong emotion, it was more likely that the investor would part with their money than if that image wasn't shown. And that matters all the more because often when visual communication is coupled with emotional appeal, that's intensified and exploited in misinformation. So, we really need to develop critical literacy that helps us understand the impact of that visual content on our emotions and then our thinking and our behaviour. And the need for that critical thinking is all the more important because stories about mental health can sometimes have unintended effects on their audience. Stories matter because the young people in our study saw them as a gateway which opened up further ways of thinking and feeling and taking action about mental health. And now some of those actions are good and some of them are less so. Now some of these challenges have been already well documented in psychology, where researchers like Lucy Fawkes and her colleagues have noted the ways in which universal mental health interventions in schools have actually led to outcomes like overinterpretation and hypervigilance. So too, the young people in our study also felt that even if they were engaging with reliable content provided from a trustworthy source, it might lead some people to focus more on their symptoms so that they ended up feeling worse rather than better. They also raised other concerns about the way that content is connected and networked in TikTok. So formats like a stitch, where one video is linked to another, might promote curiosity about that original video. And so even if the video afterwards is saying, that one's wrong, if you can see that original video and it's got some kind of hook in it and you can just access it by clicking on it, then there's a possibility that somebody might get drawn down the metaphorical rabbit hole and end up viewing content that then feeds the algorithm so that they end up seeing more of that negative content on their For You page. I've talked so far about the day in the life videos that are about anxiety. But actually, in our data, there were a whole range of those day-in-the-life type formats that related to a range of other experiences, including what I eat in a day videos and day in the life of a psych ward. And the young people in our study raised concerns, especially in relation to material that was to do with eating disorders, where even encountering content that might be positive and showing recovery, that might be an inspirational role model for one person, could equally be triggering for somebody else. So, what we can take away from this is that for young people, for all of us, in fact, good quality, engaging stories on its own is not enough. We also need guidance on how to interpret and to respond to that content safely. What we find is a three-part puzzle in two halves. On the one hand, stories matter because they can contribute positively towards mental health literacy. They can offer us information to understand the experiences of mental health and illness. They can help normalize mental health challenges. They can offer inspiration, point to resources, and provide support. They really matter in a good way. But on the other hand, they also matter because depending on the quality of the information, whether people choose to engage with them or not, and how they engage with them, there are some risks to the outcomes that might emerge. There's a risk that misinformation might lead to harm. There's a risk that people might not watch useful content because it doesn't seem very engaging. There's a risk that even if you engage with good content, the way that you interpret the stories might not always be helpful. There is a need for wisdom. And there's another challenge, because the ability to act on the stories in a positive way might not always be possible. If mental health literacy is to empower people to make informed decisions about their health and well-being, we also need to be realistic about the barriers that make it difficult for young people to get the help they need. The young people in our study were candid about the challenges they had to navigate in seeking that help. In part, some of that is due to the lack of professional help, what they described as waiting lists that had become very, very difficult. But it also depended upon social attitudes and challenging social attitudes that still persisted. So that included, in some cases, how they perceived their parents' attitudes. Now I'm saying it's their perception of their parents' attitudes, not actually their parents' attitudes. We don't know because we haven't talked to their parents, not yet, anyway. It also ran along gendered lines. So Alexandra mentioned some of my early work where I began to be really interested in how storytelling and gender played out. Well, in this case, there were barriers actually for all types of gendered identity, whether that was somebody who identified as queer and then found it very difficult to access healthcare, whether it was young women who felt that their mental health was being dismissed, or whether it was young men who felt that mental health campaigns were falling short. Are stories enough? Not always. But while they cannot provide the whole solution, they do give us a starting point from which we can move forward. For me, stories matter because people matter. And as people, we have at least some measure of agency, both in terms of what we share in our stories and how we choose to respond. And because of this, I remain persistently, defiantly, perhaps controversially hopeful. I'm hopeful that the stories we analysed in our videos and that we listened to in our interviews and focus groups are not the end of the matter. What they do is they help us see where there is still work to be done in lots of ways and on many levels. Understanding how young people respond to stories about mental health, what's helpful and what's challenging to them, is a vital first step towards creating resources that help young people navigate social media more effectively. And we have begun to act on this, working with young people to do so. Earlier this year, on a day which felt considerably more like summer than today has done, we gathered 22 young people from across the UK who came and they heard insights from us and they heard evidence from us, and then they deliberated in what we called youth juries to decide which for them were the priorities they wanted us to take forward and to give us a steer on how they thought we should do this. And on the day, they presented their requests to policymakers, and we, as a research team, are now taking that forward. We've already begun to do this. We have been to TikTok's Clinician Creator Network. That's a group of NHS professionals who are working with TikTok's safety and wellbeing team to amplify reliable health content in the UK. But we've got lots more that we're going to do. We know that there's no single solution that will help boost the value of good stories and promote positive mental health literacy, and will tackle the risks of misinformation, disengagement, and meet the need for wisdom that we need to engage with stories about mental health effectively. After all, young people are not a single unified group. They experience their mental health differently on different times, sometimes even differently within the same day. What we need is a holistic approach, which includes promoting stories that combine reliable information and relatable styles for a more diverse range of young people. People, in fact, not just young people. We need to improve media literacy by developing peer-led educational resources for young people that will also help their families and carers support them. And alongside that, we need to call for changes in regulation, especially that will combat misinformation. And perhaps there's something for all of us here too, that we can all learn to listen more closely to the stories that we hear and that we tell, and to think critically about how we respond. And if you share my conviction that change is possible, even in the face of the challenges that we see, and you'd like to be involved in being part of that change, maybe as a teacher, as a parent, as a carer, as a content creator, as a young person, a not so young person, anybody who's interested in just finding out what we're doing next, we would love you to stay in touch. Okay. I'm fully aware that time really is pressing, and I'm standing between you and another drink and the weekend. But I've always maintained that when you write a book, the very best part of it is actually the acknowledgements section, the bit where you get to name and thank the people who are part of the process behind the scenes. If my work as an academic were to have an acknowledgements section, I would need a lot of space, because there have been so many brilliant people who have been part of the journey. I've already mentioned the colleagues who are part of the Influencer Stories project. You really are amazing. Where are you? I can see some of you. Yeah, there you are. You're amazing. Thank you. You are just a joy to work with. brilliant. Thank you very much for just being part of that. I hope we get to do lots more. Yeah, genuinely, I do. Thank you to the many colleagues who have inspired and challenged my thinking, who have been role models to me, who've helped me to learn how to study language, how to study stories, and make sense of what they do. I'd especially like to thank my colleagues in the Department of Linguistics and Communication. You really, where are you? I can see some of you. You're hidden, you're all over the place, so I need to take a big step back and just say thank you for being the most supportive, collegial, and the best kinds of critical friends that I could ask for. There are those of you who are in the room who have mentored me, both formally and informally, and without your conversations, I absolutely would not be the person that I am today. Susan Huntston, Jeanette Littlemore, Saganti John, Kate Coleman, thank you for the wisdom and words in season that you brought into my life. I hope I've made you proud. I would like to thank Matt Cluley and his team for all of their help organising today, and to Brett Best for interpreting. Thank you. To my friends and my family, thank you for making the journey into my world and seeing what I do in my day job. Thank you for coming, for being here to cheer me on. Thank you for all the ways that you have cheered me on in ways that people who are usually in these rooms never get to see. Thank you. I shouldn't have looked at you. I got one more thank you. I got one more thank you. And that's to the young people who have been part of this research, who were part of the conversations that helped me come to this idea in the first place, who shaped the grant application, who have been part of the research so far. Thank you. For those of you who will be part of the research coming next, thank you. To those young people who will benefit from our work, you are why this research matters to me. Thank you, all of you, because I want to leave you with this one final thought about why stories matter. They matter because you do, each one of you. So thank you for being here today. Thank you for joining me on this special occasion. I hope you understand a little bit more about why stories matter, at least why they matter to me, and that you enjoy having a drink with us now and have an absolutely lovely weekend. Thank you so much.